Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and I welcome you to another series of our early career researcher webinar that we have been doing at the International Water Management Institute, New Delhi office. Today is our webinar number 9 of the series, and we are very fortunate to have Vartika Singh from IFPRI New Delhi and IFPRI and IIM Ahmedabad. Vartika is a senior research analyst in the Environment Production and Technology Division of IFPRI based in New Delhi. And she's a senior research officer at the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. Vartika is currently pursuing her PhD from Humboldt University in Berlin, Germany, and is a guest researcher at the Potsdam Institute of Climate Impact Research. Her interest includes CGE and PE modeling to assess integrated assessment of water, energy, and climate policies. These activities form her PhD dissertation work as well as the Nexus Gain initiative by the CGIAR. She has previously worked on applied behavioral microeconomic experiments to address barriers in sustainable intensification of agriculture as a part of the CISA initiative, the Cereal System Initiative for South Asia. She holds a master's degree in development studies from Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai and a bachelor's in economics from Hindu College in Delhi University. Welcome, Vartika. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Aditi Mukherjee, and I have been curating this talk for the past 9 months. And we have another 4 or 5 talks scheduled for the next couple of months. Vartika's topic today would be sustainable transformation pathways for India, the case of food and water. So that is of a critical interest to the CGIAR as a whole, given our whole agenda of the CGIAR being transforming water, food and land systems under a climate crisis. So what Vartika's topic today is very, very topical to the work that the CG does, to the work that IMI does as a whole, and IFPRI does, of course. So over to you, Vartika. It'll have some 35, 40 minutes and then followed up by questions and answers. So yeah, over to you. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Aditi, for the elaborate introduction. And as you said, the topic that I'm going to talk about is quite relevant and very topical in the conversations that we're having. And thank you to all the attendees who are here today. Let's hope we make your hour worthwhile. So I will just go ahead and start my presentation. If someone can confirm if you see the whole screen. You do? Okay, yes. You don't see my notes? Yes. Good. Yes. Thank you. So the topic for my conversation today is sustainable transformation pathways for India. This is the case of water, food, and land. And I'm going to talk about a couple of case studies that I have been working on using this framework of looking at sustainable transformation pathways for India and a model, a partial equilibrium model that I have been using along with my colleagues at IIM Ahmedabad to evaluate these pathways for India. So in my presentation plan, I'll first lay out the narrative for challenges with climate change and sustainable development in India, and then shortly talk about the Fable Consortium in India, under which all the activities that I am pursuing as part of my PhD and this topic essentially will be covered. Then I will talk a little bit about the modeling framework that we are using, ongoing activities, results, and plans ahead, not too much in detail, but then I will then focus on the case studies that I have worked on, which is regulatory water policies for India and planetary healthy diets. So evaluation of those in the case for India. So very briefly, recently, I mean, Aditi is here, you're a co-author of this report. This is AR6 IPCC climate change synthesis report. And the authors of this report have narrated that with high confidence, there is unsustainable energy use, and land use change, patterns of consumption and production across regions. So all of these are contributing to climate change, which is expected to have adverse impacts on agricultural production. Specifically, there are adverse and positive impacts which can be attributed to physical water availability and animal and livestock health and productivity. So there are a lot of issues related to climate change that have been highlighted to this report, but I kind of pulled out only the most relevant ones for our analysis, because climate change, the impacts of which are expected to cause increased probability of crop failure. This is from the 2019 report already, but also increasingly there's more evidence and more conclusions that have emerged from this. There are also increased incidences of droughts and floods, increased foodborne and other infectious diseases, reduction in biodiversity, and implications on health and nutrition indicators, such as increase in all forms of malnutrition or obesity. So the overarching effects of climate change can be felt all over and in multiple sectors as a whole. In India specifically, because there is a strong dependence on the agricultural sector for food demand, for a major share of population that remains employed in the agricultural sector, and dependence upon livestock field requirements are immense, which is why this becomes more important for us to discuss in the case of India and how we can go about it. Looking at the health indicators, so about 14.5% of India's population is undernourished. There are high rates of stunting, even amongst preschoolers and adult women. Healthy diets, which have been taking the narrative globally as well, they have been found to be unaffordable for over 2/3 of the population in India. But at the same time, agricultural sector continues to emit greenhouse gas emissions, which also cause global warming. Compared to other regions, India is not a major emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, but our livestock sector still remains a matter of concern. But because it is interdependence for food security, looking at issues with relevance to the agriculture sector and GHG emissions remain crucial for us in India. 80% of fresh water is used for the production of cereal crops, rice and wheat, which are the major crops currently grown in India, and a large number of national and state policies that promote the cultivation of cereal crops for food self-sufficiency requirements have been ongoing since the last 5 decades or so. And India is ranked about 38 out of 70 countries in the Food Sustainability Index, which is a matter of concern, mainly due to nutrition and sustainable agricultural challenges. So what do we do about it? In the scientific space, there are conversations that we need to look at, assessments that help us understand the role between agriculture, environment, and nutritional policies on one another. The policy framework that often happens in silos. So the Department of Agriculture doesn't talk to the Department of Health in looking at their policies and what repercussions one policy can have on the other. So we need to evaluate these linkages scientifically and to look at pathways that bring convergence across SDGs. So there are multiple SDGs targets have been created, but in trying to achieve one, we may or may not be able to achieve the other, is the line of thinking that we want to look at, and to identify the synergies and trade-offs between approaches. So there is a short-term crisis response versus long-term mitigation and adaptation measures. So we also need to evaluate these when recommending national or state level policies. So then what we are doing as a group, this is the Fable Consortium. This is a network for sustainable food systems at national and global scales. This is the Food, Agriculture, Biodiversity, Land Use and Energy Consortium. This is a global consortium launched in 2017, operating as part of the Food and Land Use Coalition. But the objective is to understand how countries can transition towards sustainable land use and food systems, and also meet the SDG goals. There are currently about 21 countries that are part of this consortium, and India is one of the major participants and the leading contributions to the consortium. And we have a Fable India group. We use technical tools such as land use models. There's a Fable calculator, and look at soft linkages between various other models to generate science-based methodology incorporating climate change assessments. Some of the topics that we have looked at is food, land, water, and energy nexus, and I will talk about those more briefly, and also done stakeholder engagement. So the case studies that I'm going to talk about today is looking at regulating water use for natural resource conservation in India, and the other one is dietary transitions and their environmental impacts. These will form essentially the first 2 chapters of my PhD thesis. So this already feels like a thesis defense. To answer these questions, I am using the model called MACPI India. This is a model for agricultural production and its impact on the environment. This is a fully open source model. So if you have a GAMS license, you can already download it and run the model basically, if you're interested, and all code is available on GitHub, including the code that we are using to generate our case studies. It's all available online. So this model is a linkage between agricultural production and its impact on the environment. And it basically works on a recursive dynamic optimization where the goal is to meet cost minimization. So in every time step, the model tries to minimize cost to produce the required agricultural, to meet the required food demand of the population, which is an exogenous scenario in the model. It operates at 3 spatial layers. So there's global layer, there's 5 to 20 world regions, it's flexible, and then 50 to 2,000 spatial clusters, which are at arc-minute resolution. And the model also balances biophysical and economic side. So there are inputs which are biophysical, which is plant growth, carbon use, nutrient use, water use, fertilizer inputs, all of these which happen on the biophysical side, and economics of agricultural production as well, which is cost, prices, demand, other policies, all these other aspects are also covered. And I have this figure which kind of basically describes the model. Some people like to call it khichdi, but I prefer a biryani because this is basically a combination of a multitude of spices and aspects that we want to look at. So on the top left, if you see, there are drivers, population, GDP, and scenarios. These are external drivers, which we use as shocks in the model to see, to perform sensitivity analyses and to look at results on various indicators of interest. There's socioeconomic data that are fed into the model globally, and which are also like region specific and obtained from various regions, and data sources from the FAO are used, but also other openly available data sources are used. And then there's this embedding of biogeophysical and climate data. So for people who work in the climate change space, there are SSP and RCP scenarios that make projections for the future based on multiple pathways. So how populations would change over time based on XYZ assumptions versus how GDP would look like for various regions, again, under various scenarios. So all of these alternatives are also embedded in the model. And the nonlinear objective function of the model is to minimize cost of production for a given amount of agricultural demand. So demand kind of features in the middle, and the focus is on food production, which also then accounts for material demand, bioenergy demand. Then agricultural production is also built in there, which has all the other aspects of factor costs of production that involves labor inputs, cost of other inputs, fertilizers, water, all of these. Crop production accounts for livestock, and then there is land use. So basically this is a land use model. So there's natural vegetation, forestry, water, urban lands, other natural lands, all of these are also included. And then there's carbon, nitrogen, and greenhouse gas policies as well, which kind of make an assessment as to how these things would change. This model is also tied to an energy systems model called REMIND, which has also been developed by the, and I forgot to mention, this model has been developed by the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. So both MACPI and REMIND, when they are integrated together, they help perform analyses related to implementation of energy costs and under various scenarios and what the implications of that would be. As I mentioned, this model has climate change mitigation measures built in, and then there are end of century projections too. So we can actually look at projections by 2100, but for all the analysis that I will be talking about, I'm only looking at 2050, which is the near horizon in modeling terminology. So using this MACPI model, we have previously, my colleagues and I, we have looked at topics of achieving food security, healthy diets transition, reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, afforestation targets, and these are some papers that we have put out, which is basically also validating the global model to be able to look at results for India. And we continue to do so based on the topics that are interesting. Also looking at global focus on various issues. So some of my colleagues are working on biofuel policy analysis, which is currently one of the major focus areas as well, to look at environmentally sustainable agricultural production. So jumping right on to the case studies, this is the first research question that I sought to answer, which is what are the impacts of implementing regulatory water policies on projected water use for agriculture, food production, and prices, as well as trade balance, because these are all interconnected, as I said before. And then this model actually allows us to look at this policy shock on all the other aspects of which there is currently not as much evidence as we would like to see. So background policy context for this, again, is that food production in the world depends on water, and India specifically is the largest consumer of fresh water globally, about 91% for food production, but 80% of which is used for rice and wheat. So they are the most water consuming, water guzzling crops. To some extent, although there is not very strong evidence against this, but to some extent, the focus has been that this is a consequence of Green Revolution, where there was focus on meeting food self-sufficiency. So large agricultural subsidies were laid out to incentivize farmers to produce rice and wheat. And specifically in the Northwest, we have example of huge energy subsidies that actually enable farmers to irrigate practically for free. And that's one of the reasons why the Northwest part of India also is currently struggling with water scarcity issues. And as I said, power subsidies in 2015-16, they were close to $12 billion, whereas irrigation subsidies were about $2 billion in 2013 and 14. This figure on the right that you see, this is a curve that shows increase in irrigated area under rice and wheat from 1960 onwards until 2010. And there has been this exponential increase in irrigated areas of wheat, for rice too, but wheat has been higher. Some states, I mean, this is a national state level policy in India, but some states actually have almost zero price for using irrigation water. So as a result, irrigation is not demand driven anymore, but dependent on the electricity supply or tariffs. And we see that about a fifth of groundwater units are either in critical or overexploited state. Studies have looked at regions, and specifically in the Northwest of India as well. But something that we find in the literature is that there are two policy measures that are generally proposed for issues such as this, which is either you reduce subsidies and increase water prices, or you impose physical restrictions or quotas on the amount of water that farmers can irrigate. Now, this doesn't happen at a farm level, but at a RWA or a water use association level in some countries where they have tested this strategy. There are issues with both. So reducing subsidies, there's very little political traction. There's differential water tariffs for different consumer groups, which have been found to bring decreases in irrigation water consumption. But there's evidence that suggests that demand for water is less elastic at lower price levels. So small changes may not bring the effect that we need. And so there's need for a middle path. Imposing physical restrictions, on the other hand, is relatively easier to implement. There are a few studies in developing countries where they've found that quotas help regulate water use at the margins, but there is little administrative capacity to implement a policy such as this. And then there are concerns that implementing constraints on a key resource, such as water, will have repercussions on the overall production patterns of the country, including prices of key crops that we're looking at, rice and wheat. There are concerns around cost of production increasing, as well as national and international commodity prices changing as well, and implications on our economy's trade balances. And some studies have assessed that, which look at virtual water trade between regions. They demonstrate that wheat and maize are exported from countries that are relatively abundant in water resources. And since India is currently also a wheat exporting country, if a tariff or restrictions on water use will be put in place, there could be some issues around India's trade balance as well. So we try to look at these policies in this paper. I try to look at these policies holistically and try to assess the implications of these policies on agricultural production, on prices, on India's trade balance, as well as water use. Within the MACPI model, this is represented as, I try to keep it as simple as possible. So water demand for all sectors is basically a summation of water demand for crops plus water demand for livestock. And water demand for crops is essentially the water demand for every crop multiplied by the irrigated area for every cell at every cellular value. And water demand for livestock is essentially production quantities plus water demand for livestock production. That includes consumption, but also water used in pasture lands for grazing that livestock actually use. And water balance in the model is obtained by summing up, saying water demand will always be either equal to or less than the water that is available in the model. And I implemented irrigation water pumping costs, which is basically this parameter IC42 pumping cost, which gets added to total cost in every time step. So there is now a cost to the water demand. And since the model is cost minimizing model, it tries to achieve an optimal solution to see that if costs increase to some extent, would it still be feasible to continue to produce in that particular region, or would it be cheaper to actually import and maybe reduce production area in this particular area? So that is the thought process of the model. So to answer the questions, I create 4 scenarios. And so the first one here is BAU, which is, apologies, I should have written business as usual. This is basically the counterfactual to say, if nothing happened and everything remained as is by 2050, what would the scenario look like? And then I implement 2 price-related policies, which is price-related effect 1, where I increase the cost of water marginally, which is about INR 8 per kilowatt hours. This is looking at highest energy price across all states in India from 2007 to 2013. Also followed by a paper by Bhattarai and others. And then there is no restriction on physical water availability, and the scenario is called basically low price. Then to make it a more ambitious and do more sensitivity analysis, I have a higher price cost, which is essentially quadrupling of India prices to INR 16 per kilowatt hours. This is a more ambitious scenario and not practically feasible, but the idea was to look at how things change. And then I have 2 quantity-related scenarios, which is basically imposing a physical restriction on water withdrawals at the cellular level and seeing how water use decisions are made. And then this quantity-related effect 2, which is, again, more ambitiously looking at a greater restriction, which is implemented through environmental flow protection policies. So what do we find? We find that water withdrawals for agricultural cultivation reduce significantly when taxes are levied. There is about 20% reduction by 2050 in a low price scenario. Taxes cause greater shock to water use than physical restrictions. And this figure is basically trying to demonstrate changes in, this is agricultural water withdrawals from 2010 to 2050. And this circle, the highlighted area is, you see by 2050, the difference between a higher physical restriction scenario and a higher cost scenario. So both of these scenarios lead to the same levels of withdrawals by 2050, but their trajectories are different. And the price policies are essentially more, what's that word? They're more concerning as compared to quota policies, but also all these policies cause differential impacts, as I just showed now. So under both policies, agricultural production takes a hit, but again, not as much. So this is the figure on total cereal production, also split by rice and wheat across scenarios. And to only look at this highlighted area, this is cereal production by 2050 across scenarios. And the BAU, the business as usual, is this yellow line. And we see that for all the scenarios, when we implement a price or a cost, there is reduction in cereal crop production, but it is marginal and not something that would bring production down to, like shatters or would reduce everything by a lot. The next bit is around large immediate impact on prices, but they get stabilized in the long run by 2050. There are greater price shocks felt for wheat production because wheat is has relatively less elasticity for water use than rice. Same for net exports, they decline in the short term but restore by 2050. So this is the figure on commodity prices. The first one is all food products, and the next one is rice and wheat. So we can see that there's the yellow line again is the BAU, and the red one is the high price, the more ambitious scenario. But for all scenarios, we see that prices are higher by 2030, but by 2050, so the prices are actually indexed to 2020. So the price value for 2020 is 1. So relatively, prices for all scenarios are also lower. They're higher than the business as usual. So if nothing happened, prices would be lower. But if we implemented any of these scenarios, prices would rise a little bit. But for wheat, there is a greater shock in the immediate future. But by 2050, it still stabilizes. And the last bit, this is on actually net exports of cereal crops across scenarios. So the bottommost panel, if you see by 2050, our exports are lower than the business as usual for all the scenarios, but we're still positive. So it's not the case that you turn into a net food importer because of these policies, but you continue to export, albeit at lower values. So here we find that both policies have benefits and shortfalls, but in the short term, the pricing policy is prohibitive, but it also needs political will. Energy in the low price scenario, I didn't have time to get into detail of the low price scenario, but it offers a suitable, feasible alternative because it is not that these prices are unheard of in India, but at the subnational level, some implementation of these policies can still be tested, and at least this evidence points towards not significant adverse effects on key economic indicators. And I mean, deeper analysis at the subnational level, particularly basin level, is actually needed to arrive at more conclusive results. I will then now quickly jump into the research question 2, which is, are healthy diets environmentally sustainable, and what gains can be had from switching to healthy diet baskets? So globally, the focus on food security is now rapidly being met with concerns on environmental degradation because continued intensive use of fertilizers, water, and other resources for agricultural production have been proven to cause negative environmental impacts, not just in India, but also in other regions and larger countries such as the US, Europe, and China. In India, the concern is mostly around excessive production and consumption of cereal crops, overdependence on milk products, and consumption of ultra-processed foods, all of which have been shown in some way or the other to contribute to adverse environmental consequences. And despite the 6-fold increase in agricultural production over the last 5 decades, we continue to face high levels of malnutrition because our diets are very, very focused on cereal consumption, whereas the consumption of other important, so as epidemiologists would say, we don't consume enough of pulses, we don't consume enough of fruits and vegetables. Our diets are also, they comprise a lot of sugar intake, which our National Institute of Nutrition kind of advises against. But to also put it in the larger perspective, the climate change and extreme weather conditions will directly impact food production, specifically cereal crops. So it becomes all the more relevant to look at alternative healthy diets that are good both for humans, but also for the planet. So as I said, as globally, there's this emphasis on planetary healthy diets. The Eat Lancet Commission recommendations, which came in 2019, garnered a lot of both interest, support, and flack for being prescriptive, but also looking at diets that were on the planetary boundaries, and we could still continue to safely consume these diets without by staying within the permissible limits of greenhouse gas emissions. So the focus was on diets that save energy, lessen food waste, and include environmental sustainability. And where they reported that, if you transition to balanced intake of most food groups, it is not that you completely stop eating one food group or the other, but this would be in favor of both humans and the environment. And the focus, key parameters of the human and planetary diet was essentially around looking at plant-based diets with significant room for consumption of animal, oceanic, and alternative proteins. Then looking at more protective foods such as fruits, vegetables, legumes, nuts, whole grains, and coarse cereals, limiting salt, sugars, and saturated fats, and then increased consumption of whole grains rather than refined grains, and then preferably no or limited ultra-processed foods. But also there are other factors, which is looking at food loss and waste, improvement in soil health, non-use of degenerated land, equity, reduction in obesity, overweight population. So all of these factors were accounted for when the Eat-Lancet diets were actually calculated and evaluated and modeled and analyzed as well. To compare, I have the diets recommended by the National Institute of Nutrition in India. This is an ICMR body, and they also they continue to make dietary recommendations, accounting for epidemiological basis, but also looking at consumption by populations. So there's this regional heterogeneity between consumption and a lot of variation across different food groups, but also looking at productivity, activity levels of the population, and all of those things combined. And in this assessment, I try to compare these two dietary recommendations. So again, very quickly in MACPI, drivers of food demand. So population, income changes, demographic structures, these are all integrated in the model to account for food demand. And then the model's goal is to actually meet this food demand by looking at various other production constraints, but also trying to minimize costs. Outputs include food demand, but also projections of anthropometric parameters such as body height and weight distribution, as well as physical activity levels. So these are also, they go as inputs in the model, but they also come as outputs in the model. And this comparison between Eat-Lancet and NIN diets, as I show, the left is the Eat-Lancet healthy plate, and this is the NIN. And I have evaluated the actual values of these two dietary recommendations, and they do not, for every food group, they do not vary more than maximum for 10 to 15% of every food group, except for sugar, which in India is 0 in the NIN, whereas the Eat-Lancet diet still recommend some consumption of sugar. So I put these two dietary recommendations in the MACPI model, and then we see what implications it has on food consumption across various food groups, but also on the environmental indicators, since Eat-Lancet diets has focused on environmental sustainability, NIN hasn't, but we still arrive at some very interesting conclusions. So here again, I implement a bunch of scenarios, but right now I only want you to focus on two, which is this eat all scenario, where the entire world, globally, everyone transitions to diets recommended by the Eat-Lancet Commission. And then this other scenario is where India transitions to our locally recommended diets, whereas the rest of the world is following EAT. Then I have a few other counterfactual scenarios where others continue to process business as usual, India transitions. But for the purpose of this seminar, I will just focus on these two, which is essentially comparing EAT and NIN for India at the moment. So the first thing we find is that there is greater diversity in food consumption. This is possible by integrating locally recommended diet baskets. And it is also possible to meet minimum dietary energy requirements. This is MDER recommended by the FAO that suggests that at least 2100 kilocalories have to be met by every individual on an average, accounting for demographic characteristics and everything, in order to meet basically minimum dietary energy requirements. So in this figure, I actually show these 3 bars. This is by 2050, and SSP2 is the business as usual. So if nothing changes, no shocks are implemented, what it would look like. The second bar is the Eat-Lancet recommendations for India, and the third one is NIN India for India, and across food groups. So what we see here is that there is increased consumption in pulses quite a lot, because those are also recommended by NIN, and we are not in a business as usual. We continue to consume very small amount of pulses, and there is reduced consumption of oils. There is consumption of dairy remains average. There is slightly reduced consumption of meat, eggs, and fish, but we are also able to meet so there's this dotted line on the top. I'm not sure how visible that is, but it is essentially 2200 kilocalories intake, and we're able to meet it across all the scenarios, but the composition of the food groups changes because that is how it is also prescribed, and we're able to actually meet that consumption calorie intake by the average population in the country. In terms of environmental indicators, what we find is that locally recommended diets have positive environmental impacts than BAU, but also they are better than EAT recommendations for India. So there's lesser expansion of pasture lands, reduced reduction of other natural lands as well, and there is reduced greenhouse gas emissions and water as well, which I don't show currently. But in this figure, I'm showing change in million hectares as compared to 2020 by 2050. And again, just for these two scenarios, if you see the ones on the right side of the axis, so in the middle is 0, and the ones on the right side is positive change as compared to 2020, and the one on the left is negative change as compared to 2020. So we see that between EAT and NI and India, EAT others, but also if you look at BAU, there is reduced expansion of pasture lands, and pasture lands, if it were to increase, would contribute to greater greenhouse emissions. So reduced increase is actually good for us. And there is also reduced expansion of other natural lands as compared to BAU. So we are not expanding, or we are not increasing production by a lot, and we're not not misutilizing conserved resources. So there's limited effects on biodiversity. Primary forests, I don't show you because we've implemented constraints that no primary forest areas change. And so basically there's no increase in cropland, and we are able to meet the agricultural production by keeping these indicators intact and actually doing better than EAT and the business as usual. So transitions to locally recommended diets, again, bottom line is that it's good for the environment. And this GHG emissions figure, where business as usual is this red line on top, and all the scenarios actually cause reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. But the second line, which is this orange one, and the second one from bottom is the EAT and the NIN. I should have just kept those, sorry. So we see that when we have NIN dietary transitions, we emit less greenhouse gas emissions from land as compared to when we were to follow a business as usual or the EAT recommended diets. I don't show the water figure here because there's still a few things that I'm figuring out. And I mean, needless to say, all of this work is currently under development, and the water paper is actually under review at a journal. So I cannot currently cite this, but this is still, again, all work in progress. So to conclude my talk, what I would like to state is that there are tools that enable analysis of both short-term scenarios for sustainable transformations, and there is a need to continue to pursue development, to make them more, to validate them even better, to also include local numbers and parameters that we can use to actually make our projections better. This will help us analyze nexus issues, so food, land, energy, water, and also enables us to understand synergies and trade-offs between various indicators. But we also need to deep dive into issues at the subnational level, because a lot of these policies are created at the subnational level, and that is what we hope to do moving ahead. So that is that's how I would like to conclude and maybe open the floor for discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Vartika. Thanks for a fascinating presentation. You covered a wide range from water to land and to food and nutrition. So, and I'm wondering, why aren't you in TAFSA? Because in TAFSA, there's something that in work package 5 that I was leading till recently, we were trying to do exactly something similar around water footprints of food system, and what happens if we try to, like, how do we grow healthy, sustainable diets within the planetary boundaries. So I thought that yours resonated so well. And yes, this is exactly, now is the time to ask questions. So either you can put your questions in Q&A or in the chat, and then I would be able to give you like talking rights, I think that's the right word, so that you can actually ask your question in person. So please go ahead. Yes, Rizwan, would you like to ask a question? I already see that there's a question that Orchishwan has asked in the chat. Maybe we can begin with that. Orchishwan, would you like to come in and ask your question? Is already in the chat. I'll just okay. Tanmay, are you able to bring in Orchishwan for?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I read the question, but now you're here, so you can.
Participant can speak. Oh, yeah. Hi, Vartika. Thanks for a very nice presentation. So I think you already saw my question. So it's basically asking that any increase in price will also lead to an increase in the minimum support price for paddy and wheat, and the profitability will not affect. So how you incorporate that in the model, but more generally, I'm interested how in the model this this factor that in India a lot of the production decision is determined by the MSP. How is that incorporated? So your comments on that would be very useful.
Thank you, Achishman. And my sense is that so MSP is essentially an exogenous scenario. And currently in the model, it does not account for MSP, but looks at shadow prices of agricultural production of various commodities. So if there is an increase in demand or increase in or reduction in supply or otherwise, is how prices would mostly get affected. I would say it is an assumption to say that increase in irrigation price will cause a consequent increase in MSP. It may or may not be. And that's something that we can always test as an exogenous scenario in the model. I haven't done that yet.
So sorry.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Achishman.
Yeah, so my point was that, I mean, I think the government rule is 1.5 times the cost
of production.
Cost of production, yeah. So if the cost of production rises, then automatically it will rise. Now, whether the government procures as that price is a question. Now we see government procures it at Punjab and Haryana, where the groundwater situation is the most problematic. So generally the argument that is given is that it ultimately it will not, like increasing irrigation costs will not affect the choice of doing paddy, because farmers will still get a higher price from government. So that's from there I'm coming. My question is coming.
No, I completely agree.
It's kind of like a policy. The moment your production cost increase, then the MSP kind of increases. It's another thing that not all farmers get that MSP facility, and where it could be most effective, that's where farmers actually get MSP. So something like this would have effects in Bihar, West Bengal, but not necessarily in Punjab and Haryana, where we would want it to have an effect. So something for you to consider, perhaps, yeah.
Yes. So when I talk about evaluating this at the subnational level, because we cannot currently do it at the national level as well, we're trying to look at for states like Bihar and Maharashtra as part of some other activity to see how changes in these exogenous policy shocks basically would have implications on production decisions. But like I said, this will be an exogenous policy scenario and can certainly be considered. So.
Okay, so Rizwan has a question followed by Izabu Beniwal, who has written question in the chat. So Rizwan, please go ahead. Are you able to unmute yourself and ask?
Yeah, I have a question related to how we can play a role of as we are in vehicle washing industry. So how we can play a role with you to reduce the consumption of 80% of fresh water, which you have mentioned in your slide. So just wanted to understand it. We are recycling the water also, around 98%.
Thank you for the question. My sense is that since this is a model, it will generate outcomes with regards to the inputs that we feed into it. So if you're saying that there are sources that enable recycling of water about 98%, we can always look at improved water use efficiency. That's one way to look at it. The other way would be to look at, again, as an exogenous policy to say that whatever water is being consumed also gets recycled to some extent. But there's a lot of technical pieces to it that we would have to look if we want to say, at least using this tool, if we want to make projections about water recycling and water saving. As economists, the two solutions that we can think of is either you tax water use or you impose physical restrictions and then see how things change. But
yeah, actually we maintain the quality of water as per the CPCB norms. So because of that, we are sending back some amount of water to the ground, and it's already captured all quality parameters of water. So if we have any plan, so we can connect and we can have a long journey with related to this industry.
Sure, thank you. This is something that we can also always talk offline and see where we can go. Yeah.
Right. Now we have a question from Izabu Beniwal.
Hi, Vartika. I had two questions. My first question is in the slide where you showed the 4 possible scenarios, one being 5 scenarios, one being business as usual. In that slide, how are you? What is your reasoning behind the figures for the pumping cost, and how are you like changing or increasing the pumping cost in each of the scenarios? And the second question is that in that biryani model that you had shown, how does the marginal cost of abatement, like, how do you see that given the model and in the short term and the longer run, like for example, in 2050, the scenarios that you've considered?
Thank you, Zabu. So for the first question regarding figures for pumping cost in India, I looked at literature and sources on energy prices in India. And there's this report in 2002 where they looked at average energy costs, which is about, should I just show that figure? Or 1 second. Yeah, so which is about 0.5 cent actually, which is the prices existing in 2004. That approximately translates to, because here we charge on volume basis. We don't charge on volume basis, we charge on kilowatt hours basis. So it's approximately 4 rupees per kilowatt hours, which is this average. So I used that since the model does projections from 1995. So we are able to use historical values for the same. For the scenarios, the low price scenario is actually a value that I selected, which was a value that has been charged in India about INR 8 per kilowatt hour. And I picked it from a paper that was also published in Environmental Research Letters by some other colleagues as well. And then the higher price is what I said is something that is more of an ambitious scenario. It is not practical, but we wanted to look at the sensitivity across prices to also see whether the model is performing in a way that we want it to perform, where the logic is that if you increase prices, it would have adverse impacts for agricultural production. So that is what I see, but that is not something that that I would conclude as a policy option. And then for quantities, the physical quantities were implemented as environmental flow protection policies, which again in the literature have said that at least in the Ganges Basin and other places in India, values between 30 to 50% of environmental flows should be reserved for environmental conservation. So I implemented a 40% value for that. And then in the ambitious scenario, I increased it slightly to 60%. So that is what I did here. And sorry, the second question.
Yeah. The second question is in that the biryani model that you've shown.
Yes.
There's this very small figure of marginal cost of abatement. So I just wanted to understand how important or how much are you considering that in the model, and how does it map out till 2050 or the scenarios that you're considering?
So I wouldn't be able to elaborate that in detail because I mean there are multiple equations in the model that actually account for it. So this is basically implemented through carbon prices and then data that are existing in the literature around how climate change trajectories would take, and if you wanted to implement policies for carbon pricing, what that would look like. So happy to again share it with you offline as well, because this is also available online, like in the open source model framework. So this accounts for changes in energy usage along with the soft linkage with the linkage that we have with the remind model, which is this energy model. It doesn't affect water use in the model as much, which is why I actually kind of didn't look into it in as much detail. But yes, I can share with you the values as well and how it's calculated.
Okay, thank you so much. Oh, just one more thing. The averages that you said for pumping costs, those are national level averages that you're using?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks. I have a question actually was around like the two policy instruments for managing groundwater, like irrigation and groundwater being the important one. One is quantity restriction that is more or less achieved through rationing of electricity. And because I mean, if you are relying mostly on groundwater, then and in places where increasingly with the expensive diesel, then largely rationing of electricity per se has achieved that goal, I suppose. And then in some places through electricity tariffs, and some states do have that. So I'm wondering, is it possible to go back, and these policies around rationing of electricity have started at least from the mid 1990s. So you have at least 10, 20, 15 to 20 years since these have started. Same with metering. Metering has started maybe not so much earlier, but maybe another 10, 15 years. So is it possible to test some of these kind of, empirically what has happened? Punjab, Haryana started rationing some point. I mean, most states right now ration electricity to 4 to 6 to 8 hours in a day. So I was wondering if you could hear your thoughts around that, and perhaps those could be also good candidates for your case studies to see states if you focus on groundwater, and then you could take up states which have tried these two different trajectories of pricing versus rationing.
I think that's a very fantastic idea. In the model framework, I wouldn't think it's doable, but empirically, certainly this can be tested to see, because we have statistics on how water consumption has changed over the years, so we can certainly look into it. Just that one aspect that I'm thinking is that rationing also involves like physical restrictions in a way that, you're not able to pull, and then it also increases costs, which can indirectly be like a cost like an increase in input costs. So this would again indirectly play a role in increasing prices, which would happen indirectly. So perhaps, yes, I think it's certainly possible and very interesting to look into. I just have to figure out like a framework of how that would be like, and yeah, we can.
And then my other comment is, and I know Mr. Pradeep Sharkar is waiting for your question, is in the recent IPCC report that got approved, you would see that there was another model, IAMs, again, developed by ISA, and some of these. Those came under a lot of critique, particularly from our Indian negotiators, largely because of the assumptions that underlie those. So actually, they did a careful look at the models, and this is, I'm talking in the context of the energy models. I don't know the kind of assumptions you have under your model. I'm just kind of alerting you to some kind of discussions that have been going on. And it turned out those models actually, when they compare between global north and south, the assumption that the global south would always have lower per capita energy use is kind of embedded in those models. So, and that kind of created quite predictably a lot of angst among the global south, because in some ways those models were perpetuating inequity in energy access. Is that somebody looking at the assumptions that are going into these models also developed in PEAK or ISA or any of these? And then the other part I know around some of the work that colleagues in IIT Bombay are doing are trying to see that a lot of these irrigation factors and others are more contextualized to the Indian context, because many of these aren't, because wheat and paddy, for instance, paddy irrigation coefficients are something I understand, not my area of specialization, but I understand from the scientific discourse, the models mostly are not calibrated to the Indian conditions. So some work is happening to do that as well. So just questioning the basic assumptions of this is something that you would be looking at, somebody else would be looking at.
So the second bit is something that we are trying to do right now, is to look at India-specific crop cultivation coefficients, and also accounting for multiple cropping and changes in calendar years, because of the global biophysical models, they actually look at indicators, again, globally, and they look at seasonal growth. And because these models operate at 5 and 10-year time steps, they don't do a job well of accounting for the 3 different crop cycles that we have in India. So yes, the second part, yes.
That's the work, some of the work that Shubhimal Ghosh and his team in IIT Bombay is doing, right, Aru? Is that?
I can take a note. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Shubhimal and his team have been doing a lot of work around these. Yeah. Okay.
Yes, and the first bit around energy assumptions. So I would both agree and disagree. Agree in the sense that yes, because we use historical values to create predictions for the future. So in a way, these inequities of low energy use per capita would continue to be used, and fairly it shouldn't be the case. But also there are alternatives in terms of different SSPs and RCP scenarios. So SSP scenarios particularly would enable us to look at different trajectories. So between various SSPs, we allow, there are options actually to look at improved infrastructure, improved governance measures, improved energy efficiency and crop production, and a bunch of other things, institutional improvements as well. So perhaps it might be also nice to look at how India, I haven't done that, and maybe, you know, it would be nice to look at how India performs under various different SSP trajectories. And then perhaps we can look at if that is actually the case. That might actually be a nice outcome, some interesting academic exercise for us. So yeah.
Right. Thanks. I don't see Mr. Shortkar. He may have dropped off the call as of now, but are there any additional questions? We still have a minute to go, and we started a couple of minutes late, so we can have 2 more minutes if there are questions anymore from anyone. So if not, we can close today's session. I think, Vartika, it was really interesting and good to see these very important questions being answered through these approaches, various approaches of modeling. Hopefully, we'll be also able to do additional case studies around empirical work, and wonderful to see this being done through Nexus Gains. I can certainly say that there is also scope for doing something similar through TAFSA, and I hope our TAFSA colleagues, and Purnima was here, would be in touch to see how those synergies can be harvested as we move forward. And good luck with completion of this work. I look forward to published papers. Yeah, thank you so much.
Fingers crossed. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah. And
Bye.
good day, everyone. Bye. See you again next month for the 10th seminar of the ECR series. So I'll see you again next month. Bye. Take care.
Bye.